Well, today I want to talk about Pizzazz magazine, and here's Pizzazz number one. Pizzazz, for those of you not familiar, was a really interesting Marvel magazine in the late 70s. Only ran about a year and a half, from about October 77 to January 79, with an additional preview issue, which I'll also show, about 16 altogether, plus the preview. It fit into several traditions of Marvel publishing at the time. One was to have actual sort of magazine size and magazine style content. Again, you can maybe tell that this is not your traditional comic size product. The other thing was to, particularly in their magazines, and Marvel had a number of things like this in the early 80s. They had another magazine called Crazy, I think, with an attempt to sort of infuse some kind of wacky Mad Magazine style humor into what they were doing. And they attempted to do that here as well. So it's basically a humor magazine for Marvel products and franchises all over the board. So here you go, the first issue. Here we got R2-D2 and C-3PO on the Tantive, and C-3PO is saying, it's Darth Vader with the ultimate weapon, looking at R2-D2, a can opener. Okay, so that's Marvel's attempt to infuse a little bit of humor and sort of bring these worlds together, you know, sort of the serious sci-fi, space opera, with a little bit of that, you know, that wacky Mad Magazine style humor that only Marvel can do. I'll show you these magazines run through and just say a little bit more about Pizzazz and a little bit more about how it connects to Star Wars. And again, you can see already in the second issue, sorry, I apologize for the glare, you see Spidey, right? And even though Star Wars isn't on the cover in every case, there's Star Wars inside. Now, I mentioned that this is a magazine, and it's not necessarily, say, a Marvel comic book or something like that. And again, don't forget that at this time, Marvel already, by October 77, they've got the Star Wars license, so they're producing comic adaptations of New Hope, and then they, after a few issues, then get into sort of original EU storyline content. Even though this is a magazine, and even though there are a number of sort of regular magazine style features, basically sort of like you might say real world magazine features, there is original Star Wars content in here. And so over the course of these 16 issues, there are Marvel Star Wars comic strips that by the end of, this is a really funny one because this was not, I did not buy this originally, but you might be able to tell that someone sort of vandalized and gave Olivia Newton-John braces. I think that's a fun thing because that's the sort of thing I used to do to magazines when I was a kid at this era as well. So I think that's kind of a fun thing here. I've got the Hulk. Over the course of these 16 issues, there are effectively two distinct Marvel Star Wars comic stories. Now, I say effectively because what happens is by the end, by the 16th issue, they don't have enough time to actually complete the final story. So for a number of years, and here's sadly sort of the last issue of Pizzazz, and it's sort of ironic that here we have a Marvel magazine, but we've got Superman from DC on the cover. And this is incidentally the special preview issue, which is interesting. I sort of think for the hardcore collectors, it's okay just to get the 16 if you're interested in the Star Wars connection. But again, as a completist, not just of Star Wars EU Legends content, but as a completist of everything, I had to get the preview issue as well. If I'm going to get basically a full run of Pizzazz, give me a full run of Pizzazz. So these two comic storylines. One's called the Keeper's World, and the other, incidentally, has two names, depending on your view about it. It sort of really depends on where you read it first, because a number of these things, in fact, all of these things, all of these comic storylines are available elsewhere. You can find them in a number of different places, and I'll tell you where, give you a little bit of the history of where they appeared elsewhere, and just sort of tell you where you can get them now. So don't worry if you can't find Pizzazz. You're able to read this stuff elsewhere, but for a long time, you weren't. And actually, the interesting thing about Pizzazz is it was something of a holy grail, I think, in EU collecting for a while, and I think for a few reasons. I think before the internet, not only was it hard to track these things down, particularly in a complete set, but I think, frankly, many people didn't even know that they really existed. I mean, these things come so early in the Star Wars timeline that, you know, by the time many people maybe get into collecting, you know, it might be that someone started even following Star Wars, say, in the 90s or in the aughts or recently, right? Or even if someone was back in the day, you know, a Star Wars fan from the very beginning, if they missed that year and a half of Marvel magazines, you might have just forgotten about this altogether. So in any event, these two stories, The Keeper's World and Kingdom of Ice, or as some know it, War on Ice, are, you know, they're pretty, you know, straightforward Star Wars adventures, swashbuckling action, largely focus on Luke and Leia, which is interesting because if you think about some of the other Star Wars content we have around this era, something like Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which largely focuses on Luke and Leia, it kind of gives you a little bit of a glimpse into maybe what sort of the Star Wars creative teams were thinking in terms of what the future of Star Wars might look like. How central was Han, in many of their views? Well, it's interesting. A lot of these stories revolve around the big two and not the big three, like we ultimately sort of see in, as the EU sort of develops, years and decades after the fact. So it's an interesting artifact of this early sort of period of Star Wars creativity. Keeper's World takes place basically right after the events of A New Hope, right after the Battle of Yavin. Kind of a neat clue to just how well R2-D2 was repaired after he gets, most of his head nearly blown off right on the back of Luke's X-Wing. There's that scene in the movie, with C-3PO wondering whether or not he can be repaired, and everyone's saying, don't worry, it'll be fine. Next thing we know cinematically, right, is that there's R2-D2 happily sort of dancing up on the, sort of up on stage on the dais at the medal ceremony, and you think everything's fine. You find out in this story, A Keeper's World, that probably wasn't repaired as well as he could have been, and so he actually takes Luke and Leia accidentally off course. They nearly, get caught up by, Imperial forces. They basically find themselves on a planet with like android children who are like taking care of the Keeper. This is the Keeper's World. That's the title. I don't know. It feels very Star Trek-y to me, actually, which I think is fine. I actually think I'm a big fan of Star Trek, and there's actually a number of stories throughout the EU that I sort of feel like really could be Star Trek if they had to. In fact, there's a few Star Trek authors who wrote for Star Wars, and I think it's like Vonda McIntyre, for instance, and I don't think it's any surprise. I think some of her work in Star Wars feels kind of Star Trek-y, honestly, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think it's an interesting thing to observe. But ultimately, they're off on this planet, and they meet these android children, and again, it's just a simple story about Luke and Leia. It just runs again through a few issues of Pizzazz. The second story is interesting, partially because of its incompleteness within Pizzazz, and it's the Kingdom of Ice. Now, the reason why it's sometimes called War on Ice is that it's incomplete by the end of Pizzazz. A little while later, the Star Wars Weekly, the UK comic magazine, tries to complete the story. And the name of some of those individual strips are War on Ice. And so, again, depending on where you first find this story, you might think of it as Kingdom of Ice if you're reading it from Pizzazz, right? If you're looking backwards, in essence, from Star Wars Weekly and War on Ice, you might sort of just apply that title across the board. So it's really sort of interchangeable. Some people say Kingdom of Ice. Some people say War on Ice. It's basically the same story. Interestingly, though, in Star Wars Weekly, you get the story completed, but in black and white. And it takes just a little while longer for the full story to come out in color in another Marvel product. And it's actually something I've talked about on a previous video, and it's one of the Marvel Illustrated books, the actual books. And again, what's neat about this is in the way that Pizzazz kind of fits into this longer tradition of Marvel attempting to produce magazine style and size products. For a long time in this period, Marvel was producing actual book size comics. And you can sort of see, and I've showed this on previous videos, really cool color adaptations of what in many cases was coming out in Marvel Comics, but they're here to finally give us the full color version of Kingdom of Ice or War on Ice. So that's what makes this, among other reasons, highly collectible, highly worthwhile, and incidentally, for a while, not unlike Pizzazz, one of those sort of rare kind of holy grails that before the internet you might not have even known existed, let alone had an easy chance to get. Now, it's relatively easy to find today, but it's gonna, and really, really good condition, is probably gonna cost you a little bit. It's not prohibitive, but it's for an old, simple comic book that produces, on the whole, largely things you can find elsewhere. It's surprisingly difficult. There's actually, as far as I know, 2 volumes of this. The second volume, much easier to find, much less expensive. This one, however, is one that might set you back just a few bucks, But again, if you're a completist, it's worth it, just in the interest of having sort of like the first appearance of the first full, complete, and color version of Kingdom of Ice or War on Ice. Now that story is interesting because presumably takes place just after the other story, and they go to a sort of related planet. It's an ice planet, so you kind of get a little, I don't know, kind of like early hints at, before Hoth, basically, you sort of realize that, yeah, Luke and Leia at least have experienced ice, so we know that at least. Again, another swashbuckling adventure. Don't want to say too much about it. Not much to say, frankly, in my view. One neat thing about it, though, is the fact that Luke basically escapes by jumping into a TIE fighter and blasting his way out. I think that's really cool. I think that's really neat imagery. So, okay, so Kingdom of Ice, War on Ice, Keeper's World, Pizzazz magazine. Thankfully, because of the internet, all easier and easier to find. Hard to find in great condition, particularly in the case of Pizzazz, hard to find in a complete collection. But for the hardcore fans, it's just worth knowing that this is some early Marvel Star Wars comic stuff. But here's the good news. If you can't find Pizzazz, if you can't find the Marvel Illustrated book, if you can't track down some of the Star Wars UK weeklies, which are also potentially hard to find depending on which issues you're looking for, look no further than the Dark Horse Omnibus of Wild Space 1. Now, I've talked about Wild Space 1 and 2, I think, in previous videos. I am a huge fan of both. I think 1 is really important because it collects some of the stuff that for years was considered holy grails by collectors. It collects things that finally make it sort of democratize this really hard to find early Star Wars content. Easy to find. Fortunately, I think this may be available digitally, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's worth tracking down both Wild Space 1 and 2 because you're not only going to find more of the Pizzazz stories, the Star Wars UK weeklies, you're going to find lots of things that I'll do more videos about down the road, but like just some really fun, sort of surprising things you might not have known existed, not just from the early era, but even just from like the prequel era and things beyond. And I'll say more about that. I'll maybe do a whole video about the 2 Wild Space omnibuses. Now, if you can't track those down, because at least in print, those are now out of publication, unfortunately, Dark Horse having lost the license, these Pizzazz comics are appearing now in the new Marvel Epic Collection. I think in this case, I think sort of the early Marvel years, I think is how it's branded. So the good news is, as hard as Pizzazz was to find for years, as sort of scarce our knowledge was about some of the stories in those was, just again, because not only was it hard to find, we just didn't know they existed for a long period of time, right? Unless you were there in the late 70s to pick it up on the news rack, unless a little while later you found the Marvel Illustrated book, unless you lived in London and could pick up Marvel UK Weekly, right? The good news is this stuff is appearing elsewhere. It's in Dark Horse Wild Space 1. It's in the new, really lovely, I have to give Marvel credit, the new things they're publishing under the Legends banner, collecting the old comics. They're doing a really great job at. They're putting some stuff in there that hasn't been seen in a long time, and the Epic Collection of the Marvel years is really worth it. So again, at the end of the day, if you're really keen to understand what happens in Keeper's World and Kingdom of the Ice, look no further than the Epic Collections. You know, not only do you get all that at a really affordable price, you get to buy it new, you get to buy it clean. You know, you're the first eye tracks you get to put on it, right? Rather than these Pizzazz magazines that have been floating around for literally 40 years as of this year. But the great thing is you're supporting something that's got the Legends banner on it. And the more things we buy with Legends banner on it, the more I think we prove to Lucasfilm, to Del Rey, to Marvel, to all the licensees, to Hasbro when it comes to action figures, right? We prove to them that there is a demand, that we have not gone away. We just woke up 3 years ago and realized that the EU was no longer, but we are here still demanding more. And the more Legend stuff we buy, the more that we'll be able to convince them that, yeah, it's time to keep this storyline going. All right, so that's Pizzazz Magazine, Pizzazz, Marvel Illustrated books, Marvel UK, Dark Horse, so much wrapped up just around 2 stories. That's just how amazing to me. This is how much fun the Star Wars EU Legends timeline is. We could talk about 2 stories, and it takes us through 40 plus years of publishing history. So Pizzazz Magazine, check it out, guys. All right, I'll see you next time. Adios.